Jason Statham stops his car for a homeless elderly woman, and what happens next shocks the world. A simple act of kindness spirals into a life-changing movement, a family reunion decades in the making, and a global call to action. Watch the emotional journey that proves one small moment can change everything. Like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts on this unforgettable story of hope and humanity. The morning was crisp in Los Angeles, with the city's usual chaos softened under a gray, brooding sky. Traffic hummed like a distant storm, and the streets, busy with ambition and indifference, were already filling with people trying to beat the rush hour. Jason Statham sat behind the wheel of his matte black Aston Martin Vantage, fingers lightly gripping the steering wheel, sunglasses hiding his eyes as he cruised through Melrose Avenue. He wasn't in a hurry. For once, his schedule was clear. No meetings, no interviews, no stunts to rehearse or scripts to review. This was rare. Jason, unlike most in Hollywood, wasn't one to seek constant attention. Fame had found him, yes, but he never let it own him. To those who knew him personally, he was as down-to-earth as he had been when he was diving off cliffs in England's coastal towns or selling perfumes on street corners to survive. He'd grown up with hardship. That kind of memory never really left a man, and it certainly hadn't left him. As he drove slowly past a rundown shopping center, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. A figure, frail, stooped, barely moving. A woman, elderly, likely in her late 70s, hunched in a ragged coat too big for her small frame, stood at the edge of the sidewalk. She had a shopping cart filled with plastic bags and what looked like torn blankets. The kind of sight Los Angeles had unfortunately grown numb to. Another forgotten soul amid the wealth and gloss. Most drivers would not even notice. Some would see and simply look away. Jason slowed down. He saw her struggling to move the cart across the intersection. The light was about to change. A horn blared behind him. Someone shouted something crude from a sports car. But Jason ignored it. He put the car in park, turned on the hazard lights, and stepped out. Traffic began to pile behind him. Horns started to fill the air like angry geese. A man in a suit leaned out his window, shouting, "What the hell are you doing?" Jason didn't even glance back. He walked across the street and gently approached the woman. She didn't notice him at first. Her attention focused entirely on pushing the cart's rusted wheels out of a pothole. When she finally looked up, her eyes were watery and tired. It was clear she hadn't had a full meal or a proper night's sleep in days, maybe weeks. "Ma'am," Jason said in a low, gentle voice, "can I help you with that?" She blinked, looked confused, a bit afraid even. Jason took off his sunglasses so she could see his eyes. "I won't hurt you," he said, crouching slightly to be more at her level. "Just want to help." A tear slid down her cheek. "You're Jason Statham." He smiled. "That's what they tell me." Another horn blared. The man in the suit behind them revved his engine in protest. Jason turned his head and shot him a look. The man shut up immediately. The woman's hands trembled. I've been trying to get across for 20 minutes. My legs, they just..." Jason didn't wait. He took hold of the cart, careful not to jostle the items too much, and slowly guided it across the street with her. As they reached the other side, a small crowd had begun to form. People took out phones. A few recognized him. Most were simply astonished that a celebrity, one known for playing tough, no-nonsense characters, had just halted traffic on one of LA's busiest streets to help someone no one else would even look at. "Where are you going?" he asked her. She looked down, embarrassed. "There's a bench near the park. I sleep there most nights. Less noise." Jason nodded, pushing the cart along with her. "What's your name?" "Eleanor," she replied softly. "Eleanor James. That's a good name," he said with a small grin. They reached the bench, worn out and graffiti-stained. She looked at it like it was a five-star hotel. She pulled out a blanket from her cart and began to sit. Jason hesitated. His instinct told him to do more. Much more. "Eleanor," he said, crouching again. "Would you mind if I sit with you for a bit?" She looked stunned. "You want it with me?" "I don't have anywhere better to be," he said, lowering himself onto the bench. She chuckled faintly, the sound rough like wind through dry leaves. "You're not like them, are you?" Jason tilted his head. Them. The ones who pass by. The ones who pretend we're not real. Or worse, who treat us like a nuisance. Jason didn't answer right away. He just sat there for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle. I've been there, he finally said. Not quite like this, but close enough to understand. She looked at him, surprised. He told her about his past, about growing up in a rough part of Shirebrook, about working odd jobs just to survive, about the times he went hungry, the times he slept in places not meant for sleeping. He didn't embellish, didn't dramatize, just told her the truth. And Eleanor listened, her cloudy eyes focused entirely on him. Passers-by continued to take photos and videos from a distance, not wanting to interrupt, but unable to look away. Word started to spread on social media. Jason Statham stops traffic for a homeless woman. Videos began to go viral, but Jason remained unaware. He was too busy listening. And then Eleanor said something that would change everything. Sometimes, she whispered, I think the world forgets we're human, that we're still someone's daughter, someone's mother. That once. I had dreams too. Jason felt something shift inside him. The bench creaked as he leaned forward. Eleanor, would you let me help you? She looked at him, suspicious. Why? Because, he said, you matter. She stared at him for a long while. Then she nodded, just once. And that was enough. Jason stood up, pulled out his phone, and made a call. Not to his agent, not to a studio, but to a friend. A real one. Someone who owned a small non-profit shelter downtown. And just like that, Eleanor James's life began to change. But neither of them knew yet just how far this moment would reach. The world was watching now, and what started as a simple act of kindness was about to explode into something much bigger than Jason could have imagined. Because the video of him pushing Eleanor's car across the street was already hitting millions of views, and soon, the media would come knocking. By the time Jason and Eleanor arrived at the small downtown shelter, a humble brick building run by a kind-hearted man named Luis Medina, the internet had already gone into a frenzy. The video, taken by a bystander on Melrose Avenue, had exploded across social media platforms. It showed Jason calmly pushing a shopping cart beside a frail, elderly woman as a stream of honking cars lined up behind him. His face was calm, his body language gentle. The caption read, Jason Statham stops traffic to help a homeless woman. No cameras, no PR, just a good man. In under an hour, it had racked up more than 6 million views. But Jason wasn't thinking about the internet. He wasn't thinking about trending hashtags or viral content. He was focused solely on Eleanor, who sat beside him in the passenger seat of his car, her fingers nervously clutching the hem of her coat. She had tried to protest when he opened the car door for her earlier. I haven't been in a car like this since 1982, she'd whispered. Well, he replied, smiling, it's overdue then. Luis met them at the door of the shelter, his arms wide open and his eyes lighting up when he saw Jason. They embraced briefly. What are you doing here, mate? Luis asked with a mix of surprise and curiosity. I've got someone who could use a warm meal and a safer place to stay, Jason said simply, nodding toward Eleanor. Luis looked at her with gentle eyes. We'd be honored to have you, ma'am. Eleanor hesitated, looking from one man to the other. Are you sure? She asked softly. Positive, Luis said. Come on in. Inside the shelter, the contrast was immediate. It wasn't luxurious, but it was warm, clean, and welcoming. A woman named Rosalie brought Eleanor a hot bowl of stew and fresh bread. Another volunteer gave her a clean pair of socks and slippers. Jason stayed by her side the whole time, his large frame seeming out of place in the small room filled with folding chairs and weathered tables. But somehow he fit right in. As Eleanor ate, Jason watched her with a quiet protectiveness. She ate slowly, with the deliberateness of someone who wasn't used to having enough. Every bite was a gift, every moment free of danger or discomfort a blessing. She told Jason bits and pieces of her story. Born in San Francisco, worked as a schoolteacher in her 20s, married at 27, widowed at 49, a daughter who moved away and never wrote back, a pension that disappeared, a series of bad luck and bad timing that eventually stripped her of everything. I used to be someone people listened to, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Now I'm invisible. Jason didn't say anything for a long time, but then he reached into his coat and pulled out a small notebook. It was battered and well-used. He opened to a blank page and handed it to her with a pen. Write, he said. She looked confused. Write your story, he said gently. Start wherever you want. You're not invisible anymore, Eleanor, and I'm going to make sure of that. She blinked, the pen trembling in her hand. Why are you doing this? Jason leaned back in his chair. Because I believe when you're in a position to help someone, you do it. No speeches, no cameras, just action. Meanwhile, the world was very much watching. News outlets picked up the story faster than wildfire in a dry forest. CNN, BBC, Good Morning America, Sky News, and even small-town papers began sharing the viral video. But what captured hearts more than the footage was what came after. Jason released a short, handwritten statement the next morning, posted to his social media accounts. Her name is Eleanor James. She's a human being. She deserves dignity, just like you and me. I didn't help her for attention. I helped her because too many people don't. Let's be better. Let's see people again. Jason. The post was shared over 12 million times in 2 days. Celebrities began reposting it. Dwayne Johnson commented, "This is the kind of strength that doesn't show up on camera." Keanu Reeves shared it with the caption, "Real heroes aren't on screen. They're on sidewalks." Even Michelle Obama quoted it in a speech about dignity and compassion. Journalists scrambled to find Eleanor's story. A local reporter managed to get an interview with her at the shelter, with Jason sitting quietly at her side. She didn't dress it up. She told her truth. The pain, the loneliness, the moments of despair. And then she pointed at Jason. "I didn't just need food," she said. "I needed to be seen." That line, "I needed to be seen," became a rallying cry. Protesters advocating for the homeless wrote it on banners. Nonprofits adopted it in campaigns. Schools invited speakers to talk about compassion. Churches quoted it in sermons. A fashion designer even stitched it onto jackets sold to raise money for shelters across California. Jason, uncomfortable with the growing attention, kept his head down. He continued to visit Eleanor, who now had a clean room at the shelter and her own cot. She was slowly regaining weight. She laughed more, and she kept writing in the notebook Jason had given her. She filled page after page with memories of students who changed her life, of a husband who once danced with her in the rain, of the little joys she used to take for granted. Jason read every page she gave him. One evening, she handed him a set of 20 handwritten pages. "This one's about my daughter," she said softly. "I'm not sure I did it right." Jason read it quietly. Then he looked up. "You did it perfectly." The next morning, Jason made another call, this time to a literary agent he trusted. He sent over scanned copies of Eleanor's writing and asked one simple question. "Can we turn this into a book?" The agent read the pages and responded within the hour. "Not only can we must." And just like that, Eleanor James went from invisible to published author in progress. But this was only the beginning, because as the manuscript was being edited and as Jason continued his quiet work behind the scenes, another piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place. One that would lead them both to an unexpected confrontation with someone from Eleanor's past, a person neither of them expected to see again. And that meeting would change everything. The rain came down in sheets the morning it happened. It was unseasonably cold for Los Angeles, and the streets glistened under a dull gray sky. Jason arrived at the shelter with a cup holder in hand. 2 large coffees from a quiet little cafe downtown, one of which he now regularly brought for Eleanor. It had become something of a ritual. She'd never asked, but the way she smiled when he handed it to her spoke volumes. "Still no cream, still 1 sugar," he said, handing her the cup. "You remembered," she whispered with a grin. "I'm becoming spoiled. You're becoming respected," he replied. She had color in her cheeks now, and her voice no longer trembled when she spoke. The volunteers adored her. The residents looked to her for comfort. And Rosalie, the woman who first greeted her at the shelter, began calling her Ms. E as a sign of affection. The book project was progressing rapidly. Jason had brought in a ghostwriter, not to overwrite Eleanor's voice, but to help her polish the manuscript. They were calling it, "I Was Someone's Daughter." The rawness of her story had stunned everyone who read it. Publishers were now bidding for the rights, each offering a higher advance than the last. Jason wasn't interested in the money. He made it clear that every dollar would go to Eleanor and to shelters like the one she now called home. And then, as if fate had been quietly listening all along, something happened. It was late in the afternoon when Rosalie rushed into the dining room, holding her phone like it was radioactive. "Jason," she said breathlessly, "you need to see this." He took the phone, squinting at the screen. It was a message, a direct message sent to the shelter's Instagram account from a woman named Chloe Carrington. The message was short, just a few lines. "I saw the videos. That's my mother. I haven't seen her in 15 years. Please tell me how to find her." Jason stared at the screen for a long moment. Then he stood up, took a breath, and walked over to Eleanor. She was working on a new piece, her writing neat, but trembling slightly from the cold. He knelt beside her. "Eleanor," he said gently, "do you know someone named Chloe Carrington?" Her pen froze mid-stroke. She didn't speak, didn't blink, and then she whispered, "That's my daughter." Jason waited. Eleanor slowly set down her pen. Her hands were shaking. Her eyes were distant, as if staring through time. "I thought she was gone," she said, barely audible. "She stopped answering my letters. Change her number. I figured she didn't want to remember me anymore. Thought I embarrassed her." "She's looking for you," Jason said. "She saw the video." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes. "I've imagined this moment 1,000 times. And now that it's here." Jason didn't rush her. He simply put his hand gently on hers. "I can set up a call," he said. "No pressure. If you're not ready." "No," she interrupted softly. "I want to see her. I have to see her." The meeting was arranged 2 days later. Jason offered to host it in a private room at a small restaurant he trusted. Discreet, warm, and quiet. No press. No phones. Just Eleanor, Jason, and Chloe. Jason drove Eleanor to the restaurant himself. She wore a dress Rosalie had found for her at a donation center. A soft lavender wool that complemented her silver hair. Jason had taken her to get her hair done the day before. It was the first time she'd seen her reflection without fear in years. As they pulled up, Eleanor clutched the armrest tightly. "Do you think she'll hate me?" she asked. Jason turned the engine off and looked her square in the eyes. "I think she's already forgiven you," he said. They entered the restaurant. Chloe was already there, sitting at a corner table by the fireplace. She looked to be in her late 30s, polished, elegant, with her mother's cheekbones and dark, thoughtful eyes. When she saw Eleanor, she stood up slowly, unsure. Eleanor froze. Chloe whispered, "Mom," and then Eleanor, without thinking, rushed into her arms. The two collapsed into each other like waves against a shore. Years of distance, resentment, misunderstanding, and grief dissolving in the warmth of a single, tear-filled embrace. Jason stepped back, giving them space. They talked for nearly 3 hours. At one point, Jason quietly excused himself, standing just outside, watching the rain paint streaks down the windows. He didn't need to listen. He could feel the healing happening on the other side of that glass. Later, Chloe came out to thank him. She hugged him tightly and whispered, "You gave me my mother back." Jason, uncomfortable with the praise, just nodded and said, "She gave herself back." But the story was far from over. Because Chloe, it turned out, was a high-powered attorney with deep connections in California's legal and housing system. And she had a mission now. She wanted to work with Jason, with Luis, with anyone who'd join her to launch a campaign, not just to raise money, but to change the system. She called it the Eleanor Project. The goal was simple: identify, assist, and reintegrate homeless elderly individuals who had been forgotten by society. It wasn't just about handouts. It was about humanizing, rehabilitating, and restoring dignity. Jason agreed to be the face of it. Chloe would be the strategist. Eleanor would be the soul. Within weeks, meetings were taking place with city officials. Corporate sponsors lined up. Hollywood's elite began contributing. Media outlets were now less focused on the viral video and more interested in the movement it had sparked. And Eleanor? She stood in front of a crowd of 500 people at the project's launch gala, her hands only shaking a little as she read from the final page of her book. I was someone's daughter. I still am. And now, I'm someone again. Don't just see us. Remember us. The standing ovation lasted more than 2 minutes. But none of it would have happened if one man hadn't stopped his car on a rainy street for a woman no one else would help. And while Jason never wanted credit, never asked for cameras or headlines, his quiet act of decency had sparked a chain reaction that was now rewriting lives. And yet, the biggest surprise of all was still waiting. Because buried in Eleanor's past was a story she hadn't yet told. Not to Jason, not to Chloe, not even to herself fully. And when it finally came out, it would not only reshape everything they thought they knew about Eleanor, it would push Jason into one of the most personal and emotional decisions of his life. The days following the gala were a blur of activity. News outlets declared the Eleanor Project a landmark humanitarian initiative, and public response was overwhelming. Donations poured in. City councils reached out to replicate the model in their own neighborhoods. Celebrities pledged to sponsor shelters under Eleanor's name. But amid the applause, Eleanor began to retreat into herself. It started subtly. Her laughter, once bright, grew quieter. She became more pensive, more inward. Jason noticed the change immediately. He was no stranger to silence. He had learned long ago to listen between words, but something about this silence was different. Heavy, like a door slowly closing. One evening, after a meeting with a city planner, he stopped by the shelter to bring Eleanor her usual lavender tea. She was in her room, sitting in a small chair by the window, the light from the street lamp outside casting soft shadows across her face. The notebook, the one Jason had given her weeks ago, was in her lap, closed. "I've been thinking," she said quietly, without turning to look at him. "There's still one story I haven't told." Jason sat beside her. "Is it one you're not ready to write?" She hesitated, then nodded. "It's the one that undid everything. The one that broke me." Jason didn't push. He simply said, "Whenever you're ready." She finally looked at him. Her eyes were glassy, vulnerable. "I was pregnant once. Before Chloe. A little boy." Jason's body stilled. He listened with complete focus, knowing instinctively this was something she had never shared. "I was 19. His name was Michael. I was young, scared, and alone. My parents disowned me when they found out. Back then, being an unwed mother wasn't something people forgave. I tried to raise him. I did, but I was working 2 jobs, and one night, he had a fever. I couldn't afford a doctor. I gave him aspirin. I thought I was doing the right thing." Her voice cracked. She reached for the cup of tea, her hand trembling. "He died that night." Jason closed his eyes, the weight of the moment pressing down like an avalanche. She continued, each word drawn from a well of pain decades deep. "I carried that guilt into every part of my life. I never told Chloe. I was afraid it would change how she saw me. I never even told my husband. I buried it, but it was always there. Every night, every quiet moment, every time I saw a child laugh in a park. It haunted me." Tears streamed down her face. "I thought God had turned his face from me, that I wasn't allowed happiness anymore, that I didn't deserve forgiveness." Jason reached over, placing his hand over hers. "You survived," he said softly, "and you still chose kindness. That's not weakness, Eleanor. That's courage." But something in Eleanor's expression shifted. There was more. "There's one more piece," she said, reaching into the drawer beside her. She pulled out an old, folded envelope, yellowed with age, edges brittle. She handed it to Jason. He opened it carefully. Inside was a letter, faded handwriting, a name, Michael James Carrington. Jason read aloud. "I gave birth in a charity ward," Eleanor said. "There were complications. He was taken to the NICU. I was unconscious for hours. When I woke up, they told me he had died. I never saw the body, never signed anything. I just accepted it. What else could I do? I was a scared girl with no money and no power." Jason looked at her, something stirring in the pit of his stomach. "You don't think he died, do you?" "I don't know," she whispered. "But something in me, something's always wondered. What if they lied? What if someone—" She didn't finish the sentence. Jason stood slowly, the letter still in his hand. "I know someone," he said, "a friend from before I started acting. He works in records, hospitals, adoptions, that sort of thing. If there's any truth to this, he'll find it." Eleanor nodded slowly. "I'm not sure what I'm hoping for." "Hope's not always about knowing what comes next," Jason replied. "Sometimes it's just daring to ask the question." The next 48 hours were tense. Jason made the call. His friend, Eric, was skeptical. 40 years was a long time, and medical records from that era were often a mess, but he agreed to dig. 3 days later, Jason got a call. "I found something," Eric said. "It wasn't easy. Took me through private archives, an old adoption ledger that had almost been destroyed in a flood. But there's a match, same date, same hospital, same mother's name." Jason's heart thudded. The boy wasn't listed as deceased. He was adopted. His name was changed. Jason swallowed hard. "What's his name now?" "Michael Stone." The name echoed in his ears. Jason sat in stunned silence. The air sucked out of the room. "There's more," Eric added. "He's alive. He lives in California. And he's a firefighter. Works in San Diego. Medal of Bravery last year. I've got his contact information." Jason was already in the car before the call ended. He drove the 2 hours to San Diego that same afternoon, pulled into a quiet residential street, and parked across from a modest home with a well-kept lawn. He sat there for 10 minutes, staring at the front door. And then it opened. A tall man stepped out, mid-40s, strong build, sharp eyes, a calm, steady walk. He bent down to tie his shoelace before heading toward a truck parked in the driveway. Jason got out of the car. "Michael," he called. The man looked up. Jason crossed the street, slow, careful. "My name's Jason Statham. I'm here on behalf of someone who might be your mother." Michael's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" Jason explained everything. He didn't sugarcoat it, just told the truth. When he was finished, Michael didn't respond. He just stood there, absorbing the weight of a revelation no one could prepare for. After a long pause, he finally said, "If this is real, if she's really out there." "She is," Jason said, "and she never stopped grieving you." Michael nodded once. "Then I want to see her." The next morning, Jason brought him to the shelter. Eleanor was sitting in the courtyard, reading her latest chapter aloud to Rosalie and a few residents. Her voice was soft but clear. Jason stepped into the courtyard first, gesturing silently for her to look up, and then Michael walked in behind him. Eleanor's book fell from her hands. She stared at the man approaching her, her lips trembling, her body frozen. "Mom," Michael said, his voice cracking. She stood slowly, walked toward him as if in a dream, then placed a trembling hand on his face. "You have his eyes," she whispered, and then she collapsed into his arms, weeping harder than Jason had ever seen. The courtyard stood in stunned silence as a mother and son, torn apart by decades, by systems, by fear, held each other for the first time. Jason turned away, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. He had seen action, loss, near death, but nothing, not a single movie or memory, had ever hit him like this. And as the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, Jason knew one thing with utter certainty. The world didn't need another hero on a screen. It needed more heroes who stopped for strangers, who listened, who saw. The photo that would later circle the globe 100 times over wasn't staged, wasn't lit by any professional crew, and wasn't meant to go public. It was taken by Rosalie on her old iPhone, hands trembling slightly from emotion. It showed Eleanor, frail, silver-haired, small in stature, wrapped tightly in the arms of a man nearly twice her size, her face buried in his shoulder, his chin resting on the crown of her head. Behind them stood Jason Statham, not posing, not smiling, just standing in silence, hands in his coat pockets, eyes lowered with a quiet reverence. The caption Rosalie posted with the photo simply read, "She found her son. He found his mother, because someone decided to stop their car." The photo went viral within hours. But this time, it wasn't about shock or celebrity. It was about completion. A story that had begun with hardship and disconnection had, through impossible grace, found its ending not in fairy tale fashion, but in the very real, gritty language of human resilience. The kind that makes you believe again. Michael began visiting the shelter regularly after that day. At first, cautiously, there were still so many questions, years of blank pages to fill. But as he spent more time with Eleanor, reading her writing, listening to the details of the life she'd lived, the life she thought she'd lost, he found himself drawn deeper into her world. He learned about his younger sister, Chloe, and reached out. Their first phone call lasted 3 hours. Their second turned into dinner. Within a month, the two of them were working together alongside Jason and Luis on the Eleanor project, expanding it beyond Los Angeles. Jason watched all of this unfold with a kind of quiet awe. He'd never imagined a single act, stepping out of his car that morning on Melrose Avenue, would lead to this. He wasn't a stranger to acts of violence, courage, or control. But this was different. This was the slow courage. The kind that doesn't come with applause or soundtracks. The kind that costs you your time, your heart, your comfort. The kind you don't do for a camera or a script, but simply because it's right. And the world had noticed. Jason was invited to speak before the United Nations on homelessness and dignity. He refused, politely, instead nominating Eleanor to take his place. She spoke in front of delegates from over 90 countries, in a modest gray blazer donated by Chloe, her words steady and clear. We are not broken things. We are not numbers or statistics. We are mothers, fathers, veterans, poets, lovers, survivors. All we want is to be seen, and maybe to be given one more chance. The speech received a standing ovation. It also led to immediate legislation proposals across 5 countries. The book, I Was Someone's Daughter, debuted at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. Eleanor donated the proceeds to the expansion of transitional housing in Southern California, insisting that every shelter built under her name include a garden space where people can plant something and watch it grow. Sometimes, she told Jason, it's enough to know something still blooms in your name. Michael, meanwhile, found healing in service. He began traveling with Eleanor and Chloe to speak at community centers, rescue shelters, and universities. His presence, solid, sincere, grounded in lived experience, brought tears to even the hardest crowds. At one event, a college student asked him what made him decide to believe in a woman he'd never met, a mother whose name had been nothing more than ink on a birth certificate. Michael had smiled and said, because Jason Statham believed in her first. Jason, standing in the wings, lowered his head. He didn't like being praised. He didn't feel like he deserved it. I just stopped my car, he always said when someone tried to credit him. But everyone knew. It wasn't just about stopping the car. It was about stepping out, walking toward someone no one else would walk toward, risking discomfort, judgment, even chaos, just to help one person. It was about seeing her. The final shelter opened exactly 1 year later. It was a bright, modern building on the edge of a quiet neighborhood, just south of downtown. Inside the lobby hung a simple framed quote, etched in brass beneath a photo of Eleanor smiling on the day she met her son. I needed to be seen. On opening day, Jason stood with Eleanor in the garden out back. She was seated on a wooden bench, the sunlight warming her face. Flowers bloomed around them, lavender, daisies, marigolds. You know, she said, sipping her tea, I never thought I'd live to see joy again. Jason smiled gently. But you didn't just see it. You created it. She turned to look at him. You did too, she said. Don't pretend otherwise. Jason chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. I just stopped the car. No, Eleanor said, voice firm. You change lives. And that's not something you do by accident. That's something you choose. A silence fell between them. Not awkward, but filled with meaning. Then she leaned over and whispered, So what now, Mr. Statham? What's next? He looked out over the garden, the shelter, the people laughing and working around them. More of this, he said quietly. More of what matters. She nodded slowly. They sat there a while longer, two people from completely different worlds, bound together not by fame or blood, but by the unlikeliest thread, a moment of compassion that dared to defy indifference. Years later, the documentary would be made about the movement. It would begin with a single scene, A grainy video of a man in a black coat getting out of his car in the middle of traffic, walking over to a frail woman struggling with a cart. The narrator would say, "This is the moment the world changed. Not because a celebrity got involved, not because it went viral, but because kindness chose not to wait." And long after Jason Statham had returned to the film sets and the red carpets, long after the spotlight had shifted somewhere else, people would still speak about the day he stopped the car. Because in that simple, quiet choice, he didn't just change one life. He reminded the world what one life is worth.